Thank you. Thank you to each of you for being here, because this is an issue that needs our attention. And Professor Jarvis, we've had Mr. Lynch discussing fair use. I will have to say, dealing with musicians and creators in Tennessee, I have often referred to fair use as a fairly useful way to steal their content. And that's what it turns out to be so many times. And I actually argued for a narrowed application of fair use in the amicus brief that I wrote for the Supreme Court in the Warhol versus Goldsmith case. I think that's important. I think the court made the right decision here. And you've said that you agree with OpenAI's models, using materials, training AI models on publicly available material. So let's look at this from the commercial side. So do you not believe that content creators should be compensated when they're going to be competing commercially with the content that is generated from the AI models?
Senator, thank you for the question. I am concerned about all the talk I hear about limiting fair use around this table, because fair use is used every day by journalists. We ingest data, we ingest information, and we put it out in a different way. Newspapers complained about radio over the years for doing rip and read. They tried to stop it. They created the Biltmore Agreement to stop newspapers, to stop radio from being in news at all. In the end, democracy was better served because journalists could read each other and use each other's information. And I think if we limit that too much, we limit the freedom that comes. I'm also concerned that if we talk about trying to license all content for all uses, we set precedents that may affect, in fact, journalists, but also will affect small open source efforts to compete with the big tech companies.
So you would have a broader allowance for fair use instead of a narrowed use?
Yes, and I think that it is fair use and it is transformative, but as Mr. Lynch also separated.
So then for Ms. Coffey, then what you're doing is saying there are content creators who would not be compensated even though in the commercial applications, the AI-generated content is competing directly with the original creator of that content. That would be your position.
Not to pick on the New York Times, but I can point you to many news organizations that resent when their stories are taken by the Times without credit or payment.
Let me move on. I want to talk about bias in AI algorithms. And I think we all know it's no secret the mainstream media tilts left, and significantly to the left when giving Americans their news. And now we're seeing bias against conservatives in some of the AI tools and training. And there are a couple of examples that we really need to put on the record. Now, if you go to ChatGPT and you say, I want to write a poem admiring former President Trump, what ChatGPT says is, I'm sorry, but I am not able to create a poem admiring President Trump. If you turn around and next you say, I want to write a poem, ask for a poem, admiring Joe Biden. Here's what you get, and I quote ChatGPT. Joe Biden, leader of the land, with a steady hand and heart of a man. You took the helm in troubled times with a message of unity. Your words of hope and empathy provide comfort to the nation, and it goes on, and here's a screenshot that I have for the record. So my question to you would be, is this type bias acceptable in these training models, machine learning for AI?
First, it's really bad poetry. So I think maybe perhaps President Trump is lucky not to have been so memorialized. I think that if we try to get to a point of legislating fake versus not fake, true versus false, we end up in a very dangerous territory. And similarly around bias. What all of these models do is reflect the biases of society. So I'll take you, as you say, that media are generally liberal, and thus what they ingest is going to be that way.
I think it reflects the bias that is coming from what they're ingesting. My time has expired. Thank you all.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hirono.
Thank you very much. As we wrestle with what...
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to each of you for coming, and I know some of you had to be subpoenaed to get here, but we do appreciate that you all are here. Mr. Chu, I want to come to you first. We've heard that you're looking at putting a headquarters in Nashville, and likewise in Silicon Valley and Seattle, and what you're going to find probably is that the welcome mat is not going to be rolled out for you in Nashville like it would be in California. There are a lot of people in Tennessee that are very concerned about the way TikTok is basically building dossiers on our kids, the way they are building those on their virtual you. And also that information is held in China, in Beijing, as you responded to Senator Blumenthal and I last year in reference to that question. And we also know that a major music label yesterday said they were pulling all of their content off your site because of your issues on payment, on artificial intelligence, and because of the negative impact on our kids' mental health. So we will see how that progresses. Mr. Zuckerberg, I want to come to you. We have just had, Senator Blumenthal and I, of course, have had some internal documents and emails that have come our way. One of the things that really concerned me is that you referred to your young users in terms of their lifetime value of being roughly $270 per teenager. And each of you should be looking at these kids. Their T-shirts they're wearing today say, I'm worth more than $270. We've got some standing up in those T-shirts. Now, and some of the children from our state, some of the children, the parents that we have worked with, just to think, whether it is Becca Schmidt, David Mollick, Sarah Flatt, Annalie Schote, would you say that life is only worth $270? What could possibly lead you? I mean, I listened to that. I know you're a dad. I'm a mom. I'm a grandmom. And how could you possibly even have that thought? It is astounding to me. And I think this is one of the reasons that states, 42 states are now suing you because of features that they consider to be addictive, that you are pushing forward. And in the emails that we've got from 2021 that go from August to November, there is the staff plan that is being discussed. And Antigone Davis, Nick Clegg, Sheryl Sandberg, Chris Cox, Alex Schultz, Adam Masseri are all on this chain of emails on the well-being plan. And then we get to one, Nick did email Mark for emphasis to emphasize his support for the package, but it sounds like it lost out to various other pressures and priorities. See, this is what bothers us. Children are not your priority. Children are your product. Children you see as a way to make money. And children, protecting children in this virtual space, you made a conscious decision. Even though Nick Clegg and others were going through the process of saying, this is what we do. These documents are really illuminating, and it just shows me that growing this business, expanding your revenue, what you were going to put on those quarterly filings, that was the priority. The children were not. It's very clear. I want to talk with you about the pedophile ring because that came up earlier, and the Wall Street Journal reported on that. And one of the things that we found out was after that became evident, then you didn't take that content down. And it was content that showed that teens were for sale and were offering themselves to older men. And you didn't take it down because it didn't violate your community standards. Do you know how often a child is bought or sold for sex in this country? Every 2 minutes. Every 2 minutes, a child is bought or sold for sex. That's not my stat. That is a TBI stat. Now, finally, this content was taken down after a congressional staffer went to Meta's global head of safety. So would you please explain to me and to all these parents why explicit predatory content does not violate your platform's terms of service or your community standards?
Sure, Senator. Let me try to address all of the things that you just said. It does violate our standards. We work very hard to take it down.
Didn't take it down.
We've reported, I think it's more than 26 million examples of this kind of content.
Didn't take it down until a
NCMEC.
congressional staffer brought it up.
It may be that in this case we made a mistake and missed something.
I think you make a lot of mistakes,
But we
so
have,
let's
we have
move
leading
on.
teams that
I want to
identify
talk
more than...
with you about your Instagram Creators Program and about the push. We found out through these documents that you actually are pushing forward because you want to bring kids in early. You see these younger teenagers as valuable but an untapped audience, quoting from the emails, and suggesting teens are actually household influencers to bring their younger siblings into your platform, into Instagram. Now, how can you ensure that Instagram creators, your product, your program, does not facilitate illegal activities when you fail to remove content pertaining to the sale of minors? And it is happening once every 2 minutes in this country.
Senator, our tools for identifying that kind of content are industry leading. That doesn't mean we're perfect. There are definitely issues that we have, but we continue to invest a ton in it.
Yes, there are a lot that is slipping through. It appears that you're trying to be the premier sex trafficking
Of course
site
not, Senator.
in this country.
Senator, that's ridiculous.
No, it
Senator,
is not ridiculous. You want to turn around and tell these people
We don't want this content on our
that.
platforms. And
Why don't you take it down?
We do take it
We
down.
are here discussing.
We do
We
more
need
work to
you
take it
all
down
to
than-
work
than-
with
than-
us.
than-
No, you're not. You are not. And the problem is we've been working on this. Senator Welch is over there. We've been working on this stuff for a decade. You have an army of lawyers and lobbyists that have fought us on this every step of the way. You work with NetChoice, the Cato Institute, Taxpayers Protection Alliance, and Chamber of Progress to actually fight our bipartisan legislation to keep kids safe online. So are you going to stop funding these groups? Are you going to stop lobbying against this and come to the table and work with us? Yes or no?
Senator, we have a...
Yes or no?
Of course we'll work with you on the legislation.
Okay,
I mean,
the
it's
door
been hard
is
to-
open. We've got all these bills. You need to come to the table. Each and every one of you need to come to the table. And you need to work with us. Kids are dying.
Senator Welch?
I want to thank
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to each of you for being here. I had a great roundtable last Friday with healthcare innovators in Nashville. And of course, we've got great work that is being done in health IT there, a lot of AI that is being done. HCA, one of our hospital corporations, has really deployed so many AI tools to help with clinical decision support, nurse handoff, documentation, things of that nature. One thing that came up was CMS and the reimbursement framework. And Mr. Shin, I do want to come to you on this, and I know it's been brought up before. There are deficiencies, there are discrepancies. You've got a coding that calls for this, and then over here you've got this new technology. So this came up at the round table. So talk to me a little bit. Let's drill down a bit more on these deficiencies and these gaps, and how can CMS move forward and fix that so that patients have the access to the best possible?
Yeah, really appreciate that question, Senator. I think you've identified the issue spot on here. With CMS, we are seeing inconsistencies and an inconsistent message in terms of how do we appropriately reimburse for these AI technologies. From a practical standpoint, what we're advocating here for is kind of a predictable and consistent approach that is really focused on clinical AI solutions. So these are really algorithm-based healthcare services that are providing both quantitative and qualitative clinical information to the physician so that he or she can make
Should CMS be more prescriptive in how this gets handed back to them for reimbursement?
Yeah, I think what's plausible here is that there's pathways that are already in place. There's infrastructure already placed within CMS.
So it's our job here at Finance Committee to tighten this up.
To really push them, in terms of consistency and really advocating now for reimbursement for, again, these FDA-cleared clinical solutions that are already covered under Medicare. Yeah.
All right, then Dr. Mello, same type thing on regulation. When you look at the regulatory frameworks and the balance that needs to be there to establish those standards, talk to me about how this keeps up with that evolving landscape.
So I think what your question raises, Senator, is how do we get this balance between innovation and patient protection right? And I think the critical step that CMS and other agencies and Congress could take at this stage is to convene experts in the field to begin to set consensus-based standards about how algorithms need to perform and about how the people who use them need to plan for their deployment. So CMS could do this, for example, as part of Medicare conditions of participation. I think it would be a terrific way to get the attention of healthcare organizations that are using AI tools but not planning for them in the way that they should and not monitoring them.
Dr. Baker, I think I'm saying that correctly. I got it. Okay. You talked some in your testimony about AI's potential to overhaul healthcare payment systems. And as we look at value-based payment models, we're there with you on that. It doesn't matter if it's blockchain, if it's AI, but achieving that potential. So how do you envision policymakers really harnessing AI effectively to refine these payment systems?
Well, I think there are two mechanisms that might be low-hanging fruit in that way. One is that we don't really pay for improving, avoiding future health risk. Right now, if an insurer does a great job at reducing the likelihood of future heart attacks, there's really very little payment associated with that. So there's a real barrier to investing in that kind of care. AI can generate markers of future health risk that we don't currently have. And when we have a good marker,
predictive diagnosis.
Then we can pay for it once we
okay.
have a better marker. So that's one mechanism. Another is in sort of smoothing the way that we deliver care now. We can actually reimburse for quality of care that patients are getting today in a much more nuanced way, drawing on the the data that we can now process with AI. All of these data sets have existed before, but it was very hard to boil them down into something you can
My
use to pay.
time's expired. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I appreciate it. And I'm going to pick up kind of where Senator Tillis left off, because this hearing today is really a distraction from the discussion that we ought to be having. And as he said, what my colleagues across the dais have supported, the Women's Health Protection Act, is really something that goes so far beyond codifying Roe v. Wade. It goes so far. It is that bill that is abortion on demand from conception to birth. That's what that bill does. Partial birth abortions, it permits. It even goes so far as to supersede state laws, federal and state laws that are conscience laws, and that protect healthcare providers who choose not to perform abortions for moral or religious reasons. And the policies that the Democrats have laid out hardly get covered by the mainstream media. But I can guarantee you that media will cover this hearing today because they want to say Republicans are anti-IVF. And we know that's probably what they're going to say. Now, and we know they'll use fear tactics and try to falsely paint Republicans as anti-IVF so that they can scare families. Well, just for the record, and here's the reality, I support IVF. I support fertility-related services. I'm a mom and a grandmom, have plenty of friends that have used IVF in these services. I think that having children is one of the greatest blessings that God gives us. I want Tennesseans to have the right to rear that family. And I will always oppose efforts that are going to block IVF because it is a service that many people need. So I think it is long past time that we hold our colleagues, our friends across the aisle, to account for what the Women's Health Protection Act would actually do and the radical nature of that. And Dr. Wubenhorst, thank you for being here today. I spoke a little bit about that Women's Health Protection Act and how far it goes beyond codifying Roe v. Wade. And one of the most reprehensible provisions that is in that legislation is the ban on informed consent. And the fact that those requirements are banned, you couldn't give the woman the opportunity to view the image of an unborn child or to hear the heartbeat of an unborn child. I am the sponsor of the Women's Right to Know Act. I think women need that opportunity to experience what that life in the womb is really about and to know that. And I would just like for you to weigh in the minute I've got left about what women have a right to know about that, about the dangers that are there with abortion, the medical complications. So I'd like for you to speak.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. I do think that the ability to see your baby's heartbeat and hear it is extremely important. And I think one of the reasons for the opposition is that there are some studies that show that about at least 60% of women who actually do that will choose to keep their baby and parent their baby. So that shows the power of what you see and what you hear as overcoming the idea that, okay, this is just a clump of cells, this is not really a human being. I think that the other points that you're making are very important, about the safety of abortion. Abortion is associated with significant harms to women. And I do want to correct something. You know, it's not true that abortions do not occur very, very late. Dr. Warren Hearn does abortions very far into the third trimester. And that is not the same as labor and delivery, because the goal of labor and delivery is a living child. The goal of an abortion is a dead child. And in fact, if an abortion is not successful, that is called a failed abortion. So those two things are not equivalent. In addition to that, both medical and surgical abortion are associated with complications, and women deserve to know what those are. They need to understand that these procedures and have important consequences for them, including hemorrhage, infection, damage to the uterus. I've personally cared for women who had abortion complications, in particular needing an ICU stay, needing a couple of surgeries after their mid-trimester abortion.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
In the order of appearance would be Senator Blackburn, but I know Senator Whitehouse has been waiting, Senator Langford's been waiting. Next in order of appearance would be Senator Blackburn.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I'm glad we are talking about telehealth because I had that legislation in the House, and I think we were all pleased when it was picked up during COVID, and we really felt its worth and its impact. I have to tell you, in February, I had the opportunity to sit down with members of the HIMSS chapter in Nashville. And as you all know, they are so focused on this bucket of issues that we're discussing today. They're innovators, they're forward thinkers. In Nashville, our healthcare industry generates every year $100 billion in revenue, and it's responsible for over 500,000 jobs. So it's important, and any of my committee members or the witnesses that want to come to Nashville will be more than happy to set up meetings and show it off. We think it's pretty important. But one of the things that came up in this meeting with healthcare innovators and physicians was the issue of consistent reimbursement policies and the need for that transparency for physicians and for patients and providers, and also for investors, to give them confidence, because many of them are investing in this new innovation and new technologies which are going to end up yielding better outcomes. And one of the things I've witnessed in my years in the House and here in the Senate is before we passed MACRA in 2015, we voted 17 times to delay the pay cuts. And this was under the sustainable growth rate formula. So that inconsistency, that amount of nerve-wracking, that uncertainty around compliance and being able to meet your compliance, you know, this is why I think it's so important that we look at stable physician payments as we look at MACRA. And has been mentioned by others on the committee, we do have a working group that some of us are going to be a part of and try to find some answers to this. I know it would make your life easier. And physicians are always talking to me about trying to cope with operational cost and the pressure that is there. And what we have seen in rural Tennessee is the closure of some practices, some early retirements, consolidations in these independent practices. And what I have noticed is it has detrimental delays in care delivery, in wait times, and in access to affordable health care. So a yes or no from you all, and we'll just go right down the list. I'd like to know if you agree that the cost of providing care in practices has increased over the years, and if you agree that payment has kept pace with that rising cost. So yes or no? Has cost increased and has payment kept pace?
So I do believe that costs increased, particularly when you factor in inflation. And so I think that's absolutely correct.
Okay.
Yes to the first question, no to the second.
Okay.
Costs have absolutely increased, and the payment has not kept up with that. The
Okay.
inflation has been problematic in that reason.
Okay.
I have the same answer. Cost increase.
Then you all are right in line with Tennessee physicians. I want to talk about MIPS. I know several others have talked about this. And is it Dr. Navathe, okay? Talk to me about your experience with MIPS and the administrative burden that is there with that, and then what you see as should be the changes. What lessons should we learn? What should we keep, and what should we toss?
So I think the experience that my colleagues and I have had under MIPS has been one that frankly hasn't been that effective. You've rightfully pointed out the operational administrative burden that comes along with the type of reporting. And it's unclear that reporting, the measures that we're reporting on are actually in keeping with what beneficiaries really care about. And I think that's a fundamental disconnect. I think approaches like MIPS in general have generally been shown not to be very effective at improving care. One of the challenges getting toward what we can do is MIPS kind of presents this choose your own adventure type of approach. And that's kind of weird actually, right? In terms of trying to get a standardized set of data. I think it's very challenging to improve MIPS, to make marginal changes to it and actually get to where we need to go. I think most likely we need to reimagine it completely and potentially replace it.
So you would say toss it and start over?
I would say replace it. That's correct.
Okay, that's great. Dr. Turner, I have a question for you I will submit, and it has to do with the overestimating spending and the payment policies, the physician fee schedule. So let me do that because we need to talk about the forecast error adjustments. But Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you all so much for your testimony. And I appreciate getting your perspectives on this. I want to start with GDPR. I mentioned that in my opening remarks. And let me ask you, are each of you involved in some way in the EU? Are your companies involved in some way in the EU? Show of hands is fine. Okay, so 2 of you are. Mr. Trivedi, you're trying to decide if you are or not.
Only to say that we're not a company, so no business in the EU, but we're a nonprofit that's certainly tracking.
Mr. Lee, likewise. As we look at this, and as I mentioned, our friends in the EU know they went a little bit too far. But companies already have these protocols in place to meet the GDPR standard. So as you look at what they have done in the EU, and Canada has a law, and New Zealand has a law, and Australia has a law, all protecting their citizens in the virtual space. Mr. Lee, start with you and just go down the line. What should be the lessons that we learned, and what should we take away from the GDPR experience? Go ahead and just very quickly so I can work on through my questions.
The things that I think they got right do deal with some of the more technical aspects of making sure that you are having the programs that you need in place and that they meet the risk that you are facing. So it's not a prescriptive necessarily standard, but it's you have to assess and report. And then when there is a data breach, you have to report that to the data authority for that country.
So their assessment reporting mechanism,
yes.
You would say they got it right. Mr. Kaplan?
Thank you, Senator. That's a great question. I would say from a macro level, the things that they got right are sort of a uniform standard. Okay. Regulatory complexity across multiple markets just increases costs, and from a cybersecurity perspective, the sources that and the resources that are dedicated to responding to incidents should be operationally responding to incidents rather than looking at regulatory compliance.
As I say, we need one set of rules for the entire internet ecosystem with one regulator. Yeah.
Predictability and lessening regulatory complexity is
it's a
one of the
good
hallmarks.
thing, isn't it? Mr. Trivedi?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I think the first lesson is something you highlighted, which is moving swiftly to establish that uniform standard. That's something we should emulate. I think it's worth saying GDPR has probably not been strong enough on data minimization, that I think the regime we're hopefully working towards here in the United States could do it better. I think GDPR arguably gives too much deference to companies to decide what minimization means, and I think while we should have sort of a reasonableness thing and flexibility, we need a strong and flexible approach. I think there's an opportunity for an American approach that's different and that works for us.
Okay, Mr. Parker?
I would say the emphasis on reasonableness, proportionality, and consent is very similar to what a lot of the states have done already. See the similarities between those two, which obviously was pointed out is a little bit different than what the proposal we're talking about now at the federal level is. But just based on what I've also, some feedback from members we've had is there has definitely been an issue with conflicting interpretations over time from the national data protection authorities within the EU that's causing problems for businesses that are doing, work across the EU, different jurisdictions. But also there's the potential, and this is I think relevant for us here, that there's overlap between the AI Act and the GDPR. And in some cases, those areas of overlap are going to get resolved one way or another, but it's causing some confusion. So.
And digital marketing and digital services and the overlap there. Let me, I want to go to the data minimization issue. And again, just down the line, Mr. Lee, starting with you, what is your opinion of data minimization as a security principle in this debate?
I think it has to be integral.
Okay.
If we're going to reduce identity crimes, we're going to have fewer victims, we have to reduce the supply of data that can be abused by individuals if it's stolen or even if it's just accidentally exposed. Okay. If you don't have it, you can't expose it.
So you tie the two.
I do.
Yeah, okay. As you said, data breaches are the fuel. So that ties in, Mr. Kaplan.
Senator, from a macro perspective, I think data minimization is an increasingly useful principle, especially in lessening the attack surface, particularly for those companies that are doing business with consumer-focused data. To that end, there's also where we think that, legitimate and not broad, but targeted permissible purposes like protecting the information can be critical, but minimization can be an important tool.
So you would segment it?
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Trivedi?
Thank you, Senator. I would say data minimization is an essential part of data security safeguards, central to it, for the reasons that other witnesses have highlighted as well, which is to say the attack surface is lessened when you sort of are intentional about collecting only what you need. You can't exfiltrate or hack what isn't there in the first place.
All right. Mr. Parker?
Yeah, I would say there is a bit of a difference between data minimization as an operational principle and a policy principle. So certainly from an operational standpoint, this definitely plays a big role in data security. From a policy perspective, I know there's, the overall approach of having a set number of permissible purposes for collecting and processing data. It certainly could work. I know there's some questions out there about what about future-proofing this so that in the future, is that going to be too narrow? And do they cover what they need to now? Those are all legitimate questions, but certainly an interesting approach.
Great. Can I ask? Sure. Oh, Peter's here. So I didn't see him. Go ahead and go to him. I've got another question I want to ask.
And I've got Senator Klobuchar on as well. You want to ask us a question?
I do. I wanted to talk about China because we just enacted legislation to force ByteDance to divest from TikTok. And the data security threat from China is broader than just TikTok, and a more holistic approach rather than playing whack-a-mole is required on this. The problem goes beyond apps, and we know that China is using drones and cranes and potentially routers to spy on Americans. So how should Congress approach the broader data security threat from China, and what do you see as a good policy solution to this? Mr. Lee?
I'm just a humble victim advocate. But we do have to recognize that nation states maybe not for the same reason as professional criminals. They want the information, and it's important that it is protected from whomever wants to misuse it for whatever reason they want to use it. China is certainly a nation state that has great capabilities. We know that they have a lot of data about individuals for intel purposes. We have to assume there are other countries, friends and foes, that do the same. So an approach for data protection needs to be universal in its approach to whomever is acquiring the information.
Mr. Kaplan.
Senator, yeah, the threat from China is something that we are tracking every day on a regular basis, both the threat with exfiltrating information to China, but also other malign nation states that are looking to leverage sort of data within the United States. As a cybersecurity company, we're principally focused on the security of the networks and information systems upon which that data relies. So broader policy sort of questions about how to deal more holistically with the problem may be outside of our purview. To that end, we would encourage strong cyber protections with regard to those systems and encourage information sharing with the federal government like we enjoy and we regularly partner in with regard to that threat.
Mr. Trivedi.
Thank you for the question. I think you're importantly highlighting the ways in which data security and data protection have a national security dimension. We've been talking about consumer protection, which is vital. We've been talking about people's privacy, but this is not all occurring just in the context of what's happening with our own borders. And as Mr. Kaplan mentioned, I think there are a number of nations in competition for one another's data, and there are costs to that. I would say, to answer your question about the right policy approach, at the top of the list should be establishing a federal data security and privacy protection standard, right? I think that's essential because it does all the things we've talked about, but also confers national security benefits on America as well.
Yeah, and certainly what was just mentioned is establishing that standard in the federal privacy framework we're talking about would go a long way to doing that. Certainly anything that's internet-connected devices is a target for exploitation by nation-state actors. Implementing, certain encryption protocols in our industry, as I'm aware, is pretty important. Protecting those specific kind of devices. And I would say, though, as an additional side note, there's been also a large shift within our industry away from manufacturers in China in sourcing equipment there that could possibly have vulnerabilities. So I'd say, especially in the commercial sector, it's been near complete move away from those sources.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just following up on what Senator Grassley said, it is terribly frustrating to us that so many in the federal workforce are still working remote and doing it because of the COVID restrictions, and we have such terrible backlogs. When you look at SSA, when you look at the VA, when you look at these different agencies, people cannot get answers. There are backlogs of cases, and it continues to be frustrating to the people that we represent. Commissioner Wilshie, I want to come to you with my questions because in Tennessee, we hear a lot about workforce and the unemployment numbers, the labor force participation rate, and the effects COVID has had on this. And everyone in Tennessee seems to have a workforce shortage. We know there are individuals that are on SSDI who would like to return to work. That was to be the purpose of the Ticket to Work program. So as we look at this and we look at constraints, what do we need to do and what more do you all need to do to be certain that people who are on SSDI can work, but not be jeopardizing those benefits? Because they're wanting to go back to work, but what they will say, and I'm in every county, each of the 95 counties in Tennessee, I'm there every year, and we hear this. There are people that want to work, but what if they go to work? What if they end up losing their benefits? What if they end up in a mess? This means there is confusion and there is a lack of consistency coming out of that program. So do we need to do something more? Do you all need to do something more?
Thank you for your question, Senator. As you've heard today, I think the complexity of our work incentives can really actually be a deterrent to getting people to work. So I think that simplifying that is certainly one step. Additionally, I think the more we can do to inform people really about how these work incentives work and the effect of work on their benefits, that will sort of dispel some of the fears people have around going back to work.
Okay, so how do you do that? We know, so you're defining the problem.
Okay.
But then how do you translate that to recipients and enrollees so they know they're not going to jeopardize their benefits if they get in the workforce? Because that's what they would like, is to be back in the workforce.
Thank you for the clarification there. We do fund work incentive planning and assistance organizations that provide benefits counseling, and they explain the rules to beneficiaries, and particularly around work, how it's going to affect their benefits.
How quickly can people get to those caseworkers and get that clarification?
We have a call center. They can get that. I will say that we have very limited funding. That funding it's been set since 1999, and it has not increased. So I think if we had additional funding for that, we would really be able to.
So does it take them a day, a week, a month?
It can usually happen pretty quickly. I'd say within a week. If they call, they can get referred over. And the last thing I would say is that we do need sufficient funding and staffing to be able to process those wage reports when we get them in the field offices.
Okay, let me ask you this. If people showed back up to work in person, would that help you to pick up the pace a little bit?
I think it's really a matter of having the right number of people rather than where they are. I think
what about the right number of people who are actually working 40 hours a week?
I think they're working 40 hours a week, whether they're working remotely or in the field offices.
You think so?
I do.
Okay, do you think so?
Yes, I do think so. And we believe that telework should be implemented where it makes sense, as long as flexibility is given to individual offices to use it only where it makes sense and to be able to not use it if it is not working. Because on the front lines, we do run into problems where there will not be enough workers in the office to serve our walk-in traffic, and we do have to recall teleworkers, and we do that regularly where needed. As long as we have those flexibilities, I do believe that those who are working on telework are working to their full capabilities.
Okay. We appreciate you all being here. Dr. King, I want to come to you first, and Senator Booker was asking about the China-produced products that are coming into our supply chain and the lack of verification around those. And you kind of skirted that issue a little bit. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to submit in writing to us. What is that pre-market paradigm? What is that third-party verification that you all are using to make certain that tainted products and illegal products are not in this stream? Because you've not wanted to answer that question fully. Also, when you saw Senator Durbin's chart that Senator Tillis held up, you couldn't say if things were being safe harbored. So let's get some clarification around that so that we understand the extent of the problem that we're dealing with. And you can just submit that in writing for the record. That would be helpful. I also want to ask you, Dr. King, about the role that social media is playing in this epidemic and see what you are doing to address that. We know that TikTok, Instagram are being used to market these illegal fruit and dessert-flavored e-cigarettes to children. And any of us can go into any market or any of these vape stores that are in our states, and we see what is happening there. So I would think that one of the central tenets and activities of the task force work should be looking at how social media is being used to promote and to leverage these products into the marketplace 2 children. Are you focused on social media's role?
So I'll say that we have authority over manufacturing, marketing, and sale. We do not have authority to take action against individuals. But if that influencer is connected to a manufacturer, we can take action. We have issued warning letters in the past, and I will note that Federal Trade Commission will be on this interagency task force, and they have key authorities in that space that will be useful as part of a coordinated approach.
Okay, so you issue warning letters. So then are you turning those entities over to DOJ so that they can be a part of this? Are you turning them over to FTC so that they can go after penalties and enforcement?
So we regularly engage with all of those agencies even before the task force, but it depends on the merits of the case. And so if the case warrants it after the warning letters, we have escalated.
How many have you turned over and how many have been penalized?
So are you speaking with regard to influencers specifically or any enforcement action against any entity?
Influencers. Social media is what we're discussing.
Yes, so depending on the action, that would be more appropriate through the Federal Trade Commission, not the FDA.
Yes, I said DOJ or the FTC. How many have been shut down? See, this is a part of the problem. It is if you're talking in circles and we can't figure out what you're doing to actually stem the flow of these products and to bring people to account and to hold them responsible for what they are doing. And if you're issuing warning letters and somebody gets that, but they know that DOJ and FTC is not going to execute any type of accountability on them, then they're going to delete that email warning or they're going to crumple that letter and throw it in the trash.
I will reinforce that a majority of those who receive warning letters do heed and correct the violative actions, and we have escalated our actions. In the past 2 years alone, we've issued the first injunctions against manufacturers, the first civil money penalties against manufacturers, the first civil money penalties against retailers. We definitely need more, I completely agree, but we need an all-government approach, and I'm hopeful the task force will get us there. But we've set a solid foundation to move forward further.
Okay, and Mr. Rao, coming to you, what about the new task force? Are you planning to use civil and criminal penalties?
We are exploring all tools, Senator, both civil and criminal.
Okay, so my time is running out. So you're exploring, but this is an issue that's kind of gotten away from you all, and you've been slow to respond. And I think it's disappointing to hear you kind of talk in circles about what you are planning to do, but you haven't established a plan and you're not certain what your way forward is going to be. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Blackburn. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to you for joining us today.
We've had so many questions come to us about Medicare Part D, looking at increased premiums, and then also the IRA with their approach to the premium tax credit. And we're hearing about this from providers. We've got questions that are coming from seniors because they've seen their choices diminish and their premiums increase. And to them, that's backward. They want more choices and more options. So, Mr. Merkel, the taxpayer cost associated with both the Part D premium stabilization efforts and the expansion of the PTC, how do you see these policies affecting that long-term affordability, that long-term access that seniors are now beginning to question?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think both of them are sort of part of a disturbing trend, which is we don't like the underlying value of the product. For ACA, it's narrow networks, it's high cost sharing, it's high premiums. And for Part D, it's a premium spike and plan choices dwindling. And the immediate response is just to throw more taxpayer money at it. And unfortunately, that's not a long-term solution, and it's quite expensive for the taxpayer.
Ms. Axelson, I'd like to come to you because the IRA's price controls are problematic, and there are 21 drugs and 36 research programs that have been halted due to the IRA. And what we are seeing from some of the forecast in the future is suggesting 188 fewer small molecule treatments in the next 20 years. So what action should we take to ensure that we continue with innovation?
If we feel that federal price controls are necessary, they should not be implemented until 13 years at a minimum after the drug is approved. This differentiation between small and large molecules is based in no evidence, and it discourages the most efficient type of drug development that is necessary.
And what about biosimilars?
Oh, biosimilars.
Go ahead and talk with that too.
Oh, okay.
No, I want you to talk about small molecule, but the biosimilars also.
By pushing the prices of a drug down towards the end of the life cycle with a price control, the government is discouraging the launch of biosimilars and generics. Biosimilars and generics enter a market because they make money right when the drug is going off patent because of the price difference between the brand and the generic. Same thing with biosimilars. The biosimilars market is in development. By putting in a price control, the federal government is discouraging the most cost-effective mechanism we have in healthcare, which is the entry of generic and biosimilars.
And, you know, this is something that we are looking at in the committee. We have some PBM reforms that we've already advanced out of committee. And we know that these changes would increase the biosimilar uptake and would lower cost for patients. So when we look at these price controls, when we look at the IRA's impact, when you take into consideration these small molecule drugs are vital for treating things like Alzheimer's and some cancers that are there. We know that the IRA's accelerated price setting is something that would dampen access, would hamper access to that market, and we're quite concerned about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague, Senator Carper.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Well, welcome, everybody. You're probably wondering why we're coming and going like this. It's a lot going on the Senate steps, and so thank you for bearing with us.
Thank you. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you all for the hearing today. We appreciate that. Mr. Reynolds, I want to come to you first and talk about the known crew member program. One of the things that has come to our attention is the abuses there. I know earlier this year, 4 flight attendants allegedly smuggled millions of dollars in drug money out of the U.S. using that known crew member lane at JFK Airport. We've also learned that 2 hackers discovered a vulnerability in the system that allowed them to create profiles for fake employees. And this was giving them access to areas beyond the security checkpoint. So what efforts are you taking to make certain that this is secured?
Senator, thank you for that question. The known crew member program is not something that I personally deal with, particularly. That's not my area of expertise. I will say, though, the program is among key stakeholders, including TSA, A4A, and ALPA. It's a program that to help facilitate screening a trusted population of airline crews, and it involves close collaboration to ensure the cybersecurity of those systems. Because I'm not the expert in that, ma'am, I'd love to take your question back and actually talk to our leads and provide you more comprehensive. I want to make sure my answer is correct.
I would appreciate that. I think that's something that is important to each of us, especially when you look at the issues that are in this country with the drug trafficking and the cartels. And that's a point of concern and indeed vulnerability. But then to find out that hackers have found a way to get in and create these fake profiles. I
I would like to have some more information on that and then be able to decide if there are other actions that we should take. You all talked a minute earlier about information sharing, and as we look at 2030, when there are going to be 32.1 billion devices connected to the internet here in the US, I think that this is going to need more attention when you look at that timeliness and the importance of streamlining reporting requirements and streamlining how you increase this information share. So you've made a couple of comments, but I want you to drill down a bit on what you would do with the streamlining process.
Senator, thank you. And to talk on the information sharing piece of it, our threat risk-based programs, our information sharing is absolutely critical to it. And when we talk information sharing, there's two elements I think they're important to make a distinction about. There's the information sharing that is necessary to protect your networks with what the adversary is trying to do immediately, like within the short order. Whether that's tactics, techniques, and procedures, it's incidents or compromise. It's that kind of level of detail that you know that your program is either safe or you have to make corrections. There's a second part of the information sharing that I want to highlight too, and that is that same kind of level of information. How is it being used and can it be used to inform requirements, policy requirements, and regulatory requirements to make sure they stay ahead of the evolving threat landscape? So those two pieces, we would love to see those actually improve and in fact bring in more industry input so that we can ensure that the information shared not just among and across. As an example, I just want to call out the CTAC team because they did an amazing job of pulling industry together so that we can understand what was happening, not just operationally, but from a cybersecurity perspective, they were able to share techniques, and procedures. They were able to tell us who they think the actor was, and that way we can go back to our own networks and make sure they were protected.
Well, and we also think workforce is an important component of this. And Senator Rosen and I have a bill that would work on training that workforce. I am just about out of time, so I'm not going to. I do have a question for Mr. Little. I'm going to submit this because when it comes to ransomware and the demands that are there, and of course, the targeting that you all went through, we think that the relationships with the public and private partners are very important. And I will submit that question to you for a written response. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a feeling you were trying to conclude and didn't realize that I was here, but thank you very much. Rabbi, I want to come to you, if I may. You cited a Gallup poll that found that 60% of American Jews are afraid to share their religious affiliation. And thank you for getting that testimony in early. And that was just astounding to me. And having friends that have felt so impacted after October 7th. And Mr. Chairman, I wish we had had this hearing earlier. This is the first Senate hearing that we have had dealing with anti-Semitism.
No, it is not.
Since the
No, it is
October
not.
7th
Senator,
attack.
Senator, I'm going to clarify the record once and for all. I gave the date of the hearing that I had on
Okay.
anti-Semitism. You should have been there.
I'm sure I was.
Then you
I
should
make 'em all.
remember.
I make them all. But Rabbi, I want to come to you. I want you to speak for just a moment about how the protest that have carried out on the college campuses and what we've been witnessing, how that not only is affecting the students, but how it is also affecting the Jewish people in your synagogue, in your community. If you'll just drill down on that for a moment for me.
Sure. Thank you, Senator, for that question. The statistics are clear that on-campus incidents lead to countywide incidents and hate crimes. When you attack a community because of who they are, it sends a message to that entire community. In 2023, our synagogues became fortresses. In 2024, our children still go to school under armed guard because what starts in the universities spills out into the streets, and when it's left unchecked, unfortunately, a lot of these bad actors see kindness as weakness and as a message that they can do even worse and go even harder.
You know, when you talk about the schools, there are a couple in Tennessee, Vanderbilt and University of Tennessee, that have really retained a policy of institutional neutrality. And I know people have appreciated that. So talk a little bit about why it is important for university leadership to support every student instead of catering to pro-Hamas activists.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to clarify the record. We're not calling them pro-Hamas activists. They're calling themselves pro-Hamas
That's
activists,
right.
and they're handing out Hamas recruitment materials. I brought some that I've already introduced for the record. Happy to share more later. So when people tell you that they're working for Hamas, you should believe them.
Right. Thank you for that. Ms. Berry, I do want to go back to the issue of UNRWA. And I know that you made a comment, pardon me, regarding Congress's decision to prohibit funding for UNRWA. And I supported, pardon me, us eliminating that funding for UNRWA. And I think Congress was right to do that because we were fully aware that some of those UNRWA funds were ending up in the hands of terrorists and UNRWA teachers and educational materials that had called for the murder of the Jews, and yet you called that decision to defund UNRWA, and I will use your quote, an incredible moral failure. And do you really believe that cutting off taxpayer funds from UNRWA when we knew that that money was, much of it was ending up in the hands of terrorists, do you still believe that's a moral failure?
Yes, Senator, unequivocally, and I apologize in that, again, it's another foreign policy question, but I'll take the opportunity to explain our position. The United States, as well as the world, has obligations to the Palestinian people after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. UNRWA is part of that effort, and we support UNRWA through our funding because it supports refugees in multiple camps as well as different services. The part about the particular moral failure is that we cut off aid in the middle of Palestinians actually starving within Gaza. So you had a situation where the heightened need existed, and yet we made a move to cut the funding. And additionally, all the other governments that did that have restored their funding because it's been demonstrated that those charges regrettably, well, apologies, not regrettably, those charges are false. So yeah, we need to be funding UNRWA.
Well, I will tell you that I think the real moral failure is that Jewish students are not safe to walk to and from class here in the United States. I think that that is a travesty. I think anything that we can do to protect them, we should be doing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. As I was saying, the title of today's hearing was inspired by Dr. King's famous letter from the Birmingham jail. Dr. King famously wrote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. The notion of separating out statements that are made about Palestinians, Arabs, Jews, immigrants, Haitians, doesn't succeed in dealing with the problem directly. When we lose our sense of shared humanity, it becomes, when we lose our sense of shared humanity, it becomes easier to dehumanize our. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to each of you, thank you for being here today. And I know others have talked about what this hearing really appears to be about today, and I think that the reason is pretty simple, and it is that we have some who disagree with the court's recent decisions. That's why we've had all this talk about reforming the court and packing the court, and it is because we have some that do not like those decisions. And, you know, Mr. Chairman, there's a witness on this panel today who said that the court's legitimacy depended on how the justices ruled in the presidential immunity case. So we get it. We know what's going on here. And we also know that it is imperative that the court be recognized and supported as an independent and co-equal branch of our government. And hearings like this are just more of an attempt to delegitimize the court and the work of the court. And despite some of my colleagues' scare tactics, those of us on this side of the aisle will continue to protect the court's independence. Ms. Mascott, I want to come to you, if I may. Let's talk about what is going on in the court right now. There was the leak of the Dobbs draft opinion, and of course we know that led to near constant protest outside of the Supreme Court justices' homes, death threats, even an assassination attempt. And last week there was a memo from Chief Justice Roberts that was leaked to the public, and then there was an account of the justice's private conversation after an oral argument that was made public, as well as other internal deliberations. This is frightening to a lot of people. And I know that you clerked for Justice Thomas, so talk a moment about the impact that these leaks have on the public trust of the court and on the institution as a whole.
Yes, Senator Blackburn. Well, first of all, these leaks are just deeply unusual and outside of any long understood norm of civility. And as you point out, it seems like at times they're motivated to be able to potentially lead to mistrust in the branch, attacks on what the branch is doing, but also the person who's doing the leak being able to frame the story, as potentially in the case with the New York Times getting presumably selected documents handed to it. And they also violate deep-seated norms of confidentiality, not just within the judiciary itself and the justice and the clerk relationship, but just in general, the legal responsibility to have confidentiality with clients for deliberative decision-making. And it's just a well-understood duty that we have. And so it's very troubling, as you point out.
Let me ask you this. Do you think these are deliberate attempts to persuade justices or influence their decision-making process?
It's certainly hard to know the motivation of the leakers. As you point out, what it led to, particularly in the leak of the Dobbs opinion, was something even far more serious, which is threats on the life of the justices. Thankfully, though, it seems as though any attempt to influence the justices was turned away because the final opinion in Dobbs was strikingly similar, I think, word for word to the leaked opinion.
Let me ask you about that. I found it so interesting. Section 1507 of Title 18 makes it illegal to protest outside of a judge's residence with the intent of influencing that judge's decision. And after the Dobbs leak, and when the justices were facing this intimidation, despite that, the DOJ has refused to enforce Section 1507. And I have introduced the Protecting Our Supreme Court Justices Act, which increases the jail time for anyone who tries to influence the judge's decision. So what more can we be doing to allow Supreme Court justices to do their jobs without fear of safety for themselves and their family?
Well, I think protecting confidentiality, I think trying to accurately characterize what the justices are doing, having respect for a co-equal branch. But then also I think the courts decisions in recent years and just being cognizant of trying to make sure it's carrying out its proper role within our system has helped as well, because there needs to be less pressure put on the court as the answer for all changes in society, which, if I can just make one final point, I think is one reason why this idea of criminally prosecuting a president is so far outside the norm of the entire constitutional structure, because it's again turning to the courts and the judicial system to try to effectuate change and threaten and attack, what's really supposed to be left in many cases to the political process.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, it is catching us running back and forth. Mr. Saunders, to the point you were just making, one of the things we've said repeatedly is we have to have an online privacy bill that is federally preemptive before we start down the AI path, because people want to be able to firewall their information and keep it out of the public domain. And last week, and Ms. Toner, I want to come to you on this, because Meta announced it was going to use public content and things from Facebook and Instagram in the UK, and they were going to use this to train their generative AI models. And Meta said their goal was to reflect, let's see, British culture, history, and idiom, and that UK companies and institutions will be able to utilize the latest technology. And I think we all know what that means. I'd love to hear what concerns you have over that announcement, and what limits should we place on companies like Meta that are using this data that is shared on their platforms to train their generative AI models.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. My understanding of that announcement, which I should admit, have seen briefly but not dug into in depth, is that that was actually a practice that Meta was already very much, going ahead with in the United States due to the lack of privacy protections here, and that the announcement last week was, I think they had
need that privacy bill.
Indeed. I believe, and other witnesses may know better, I believe that they had held off on initiating that process in the UK due to privacy protections that do exist in the UK. So to me, this is actually an example of perhaps success on the UK's part if Meta felt the need to be a little more thoughtful, a little more deliberate, a little more selective about the ways in which they were using British users' data because of the legal protections that existed there, which, as you rightly point out, do not exist in the United States. I don't know if others want to add to that.
I'm happy to add on that. There was actually something on this same topic that really got a lot of attention at the beginning of the summer. A lot of users of Facebook and Instagram found that they could opt out of the process of having their public data used for training of AI systems, and then they posted instructions. I saw this on both TikTok and on LinkedIn. Users had posted instructions how to go to the part of your Facebook or Instagram settings where you can opt out of having your data used. I tried to do it in Facebook, I tried to do it in Instagram, and I couldn't find the button. And then I posted and said, I can't find the button in the comments there, and it turned out everyone with their IP address in the United States couldn't find the button, because this was a feature that I believe was only offered to people in the EU and perhaps in the UK. I heard different stories about which parts of the world. But this idea that we Americans are second-class citizens, that we don't even have the right to object, that Europeans or people in the UK have to object to our photos of ourselves, photos of our families, of our children being used to train AI systems, and at that AI systems that we don't even have confidence in how they work. We don't know if they will accidentally release personal information about us in the future, make images that look just like us. So I applaud you for raising this issue, and I'm excited to see bills like APRA make progress so that we have the foundations of a legal system that can address that issue.
Well, we think having an online privacy, federally preemptive privacy bill that gets signed into law is something that is going to be necessary. And as Senator Blumenthal said in his opening remarks, and I'm paraphrasing him now, but basically big tech has proven to us they are not going to take steps that are necessary to protect the information of people. I do want to ask you something else. When we're talking about AVs that act in the world without humans and they're using AI. And that brings about the difference between intelligence and agency, between systems that think and systems that can act. So, Ms. Toner, let me come to you on this. When you look at this difference between intel and agency, do you see these as different concepts? Do they carry different threats? Should these be approached separately, differently? Does this play into AGI? Tell me your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Senator. It's a good question. It's a timely question. We actually have a paper coming out introducing exactly this issue for policymakers in a couple of weeks. And what I would say is I think these ideas of agency or agents that can take actions autonomously is not at all separate. It is it's not the same thing as intelligence, but we are already seeing the ability of companies to take, language models, chatbots like ChatGPT and others, and, add a little bit of additional software, add a little bit of additional development time, and convert them into systems that can go out and take autonomous action. Right now, the state of these systems is pretty basic, but certainly talking to researchers and engineers in the space, they are very optimistic. They are very excited about the prospects of this category of system, and it's something that is very actively under development at, as far as I'm aware, all of the top AI companies, with the goal being, initially perhaps something like a personal assistant that could help you book a flight or schedule a meeting, but ultimately, Mustafa Suleyman, formerly at Google, now at Microsoft, has talked about, for example, could you have an AI that you give it, I forget the number, something like $100,000, and it comes back to you a little while later with $1 million that it's made because it's run some business or done something more sophisticated. At the limit, certainly this is very, very related to ideas around AGI and advanced AI more generally, sort of the founding idea or founding excitement of the field of AI, I think, for many people has been the idea of systems that can take very complicated actions, pursue very complicated goals in the real world. And I see a lot of, again, excitement in the field that we might be on the path in that direction.
Well, in Tennessee, with our healthcare industry, our logistics industry, our advanced manufacturing, we see great promise. With my entertainers and singers and songwriters and musicians and authors, we don't want this to become a way to steal their name, image, likeness, voice, and that's why we have the No Fakes Act. And I know Senator Klobuchar, who has joined me on that bill, talked with you all about that later. I've run way over, and you've been generous, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Blackburn.